Howdy y'all, and welcome back to another episode of SmoothBrainEDH, where we make the smoothest plays with the biggest brains. This week, we have a high-powered game featuring some new brews, so let's see what everyone is piloting. First is Seth on his Najeela, the Blade Blossom list. Seth has an interesting deck building restriction, borderless cards only. Within this restriction, he's wanting to overrun his opponents with hordes of warriors. Next up is Jason playing his Ketramose, the new Dawn list. Jason's giving his list another whirl on the channel, looking to move things in and out of exile to gain massive card advantage. Third is Matt playing Animar, Soul of the Elements. It's an Animar deck, looking to snowball creatures out using Animar's cost reduction and cast expensive creatures for cheap. And last is Ethan, who brought Shorikai, Genesis Engine. Ethan built this as a blue-white artifact deck, looking to use untappers like Manifold Key to draw a bunch of cards with Shorikai. We're about to get to the game, but before that, if you'll go ahead and give us a like and let us know down in the comments which deck you're rooting for. Links to our socials, our deck list, and our Discord are in the description down below. Our channel is partnered with Dragon Shield, so if you want to pick up any new sleeves or magic-related product, check out the affiliate link down in the description below. Thanks to Dragon Shield for giving us the code SMOOTH5, so use that for 5% off your entire order at checkout. Now, on to the game.
Looks like Seth wins the die roll, but Matt's got the pregame of Gemstone Caverns, and he'll exile Mental Misstep. Funnily enough, Jason's a fan of this. Anyways, Seth plays Ketria Triome and passes. Jason plays a Marsh Flats, and he goes ahead and fetches 4 Shadowy Backstreet. He passes while searching, and spoiler, Surveil stays on top. Alright, on Matt's turn, he'll play Rejuvenating Springs, then he'll cast a 3 Visits, and he finds a tap Stomping Ground off this, and then passes to Ethan, who will just play a Tundra and pass. Seth will start his turn off by shocking in a Hollowed Fountain, and then he'll cast Nature's Lore. This will find Spara's headquarters, and then he passes to Jason. Jason will shock in a Godless Shrine, and since Seth has one more land than him, he'll cast his Loyal Warhound. He finds a Plains and then passes to Matt, who starts with Animar. He'll then play a Misty Rainforest as land for turn and fetch with it. He says he's going to go get a Tropical Island and cast Birds of Paradise with it, which will trigger Animar, getting him a counter. And then he'll pass the turn to Ethan, who plays Exotic Orchard into Talisman of Progress. Then he'll pass. Seth plays a Jetmir's Garden, and then he'll cast Balin and pass to Jason, who immediately moves to combat and swings for 3 at Seth, who will just take it. Jason will then play Grim Climb Pathway and cast Orzhov Signet. Then he'll cast Ketramose and pass the turn to Matt. Matt will start off with a Delighted Halfling, Animar trigger. Then he'll move to combat and swing for 3 at Jason, and Jason can't block it, so he'll take the 3 commander. Then Matt will pass the turn to Ethan, who will drop a Plains, and then the One Ring. On ETB, he gains Pro Everything. The turn is then passed to Seth, and he starts off with Shattered Sanctum as land for turn. Then he'll cast Najeela, and then Seer Slicer Goblin. After this, he moves to combat and swings for 4 over at Matt. There is a Najeela trigger, and the 1/1 warrior is swung over at Ethan. He can't take damage, but Seth wants to ensure it survives combat. Anyways, Matt will take his 4, and then Seth passes the turn, and he gets a 1/1 Goblin off the raid trigger. Now on Jason's turn, he'll start off with a Wall of Omens and draw a card on ETB. Then he'll drop Recruiter of the Guard. ETB trigger will tutor a Boggart Trawler to his hand, and then he'll play the backside as land for turn, and he decides to have it enter tapped. Then he'll pass the turn to Matt, and he'll start off with Elvish Mystic, Animar trigger. He'll then cast Disciple of Freyalise, and there's another Animar trigger, and on ETB, he will sacrifice Animar to draw 5 and gain 5. He'll then pass the turn to Ethan, who stops on instep to activate the One Ring, so it gets a counter and he draws a card. Then on his upkeep, he'll lose a life. He'll then play an island and then cast Shorikai, and then passes, a quick and easy turn. Seth immediately moves to combat, and Ethan stays on first main. Ethan knows full well that everything and the new warriors created are coming at him, so he decides to Path to Exile Najeela before he can get hit. And unfortunately for Seth, he has no basics in that deck. Still unfortunately, but this time for Ethan, he probably should have Pathed Najeela in combat, not on first main, cause Seth will just recast her, then move to combat. Everything but the Goblin token is swung over at Ethan, and 3 more 1/1 warriors are made, also swinging at Ethan. So Ethan will take 10, going down to 29. And then Seth will pass the turn to Jason, and he gets another Goblin on instep. Jason will start his turn off with a Sword of Hearthenhome, and he'll equip it to his Hound. Then he'll move to combat and swing over at Matt, who has to take it. Combat damage trigger will flicker Recruiter of the Guard and get him a basic to the battlefield. And there will be a Ketramose trigger after that. When the Recruiter of the Guard hits the field again, it'll tutor Solitude to Jason's hand. Then the turn is passed to Matt. He'll start off with a basic forest, and then he'll tap for 5 and recast Animar. After this, he'll cast Benevolent Hydra, X's 1, Animar trigger. And then the turn is passed to Ethan, who activates the One Ring again on instep. Then on his turn, he'll start off with a Prairie Stream. And after a bit of consideration, he decides now's a good time for a Supreme Verdict. Jason's the only one with a response. He will channel Touch the Spirit Realm to exile his Recruiter of the Guard until the end step. So yeah, that happens, and the Supreme Verdict resolves. Ethan will then cast Esper Sentinel and pass the turn to Seth. Recruiter comes back, and Jason gets a Flicker Wisp. Seth will start off with a Deserted Beaches land for turn, and then he'll tap for 3 to cycle his Zoggoth Triome. Then he'll cast Azuri Claw of Progress and pass to Jason, and he immediately equips his sword to his Recruiter of the Guard. Then moves to combat and hits Seth for 3 and gets a combat damage trigger. Another basic is tutored, Recruiter is flickered, and there's a Ketramose trigger. Also, the tutor off Recruiter gets Emperor of Bones. Post-combat, he'll play Ifnir Deadlands as land for turn, then cast Panharmonicon. One is not paid to Esper Sentinel, and Ethan decides to offer you can't refuse it, so it's countered. Jason does get 2 treasures off this though. After this, he'll cast Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff, and then he'll drop a Flicker Wisp. And since it says it can flicker any permanent, he's going to target his Boggart Bog. Then when he moves to end step, it'll come back as the Boggart Trawler, and he exiles Matt's Graveyard, which turns on Ketramose. There's also a Ketramose trigger, and there was also one from the Flicker Wisp. The turn is then passed to Matt, and he'll just cast a Kami of Whispered Hopes, and pass to Ethan. And of course, we've got another One Ring activation on end step. Then on his turn, Ethan will play a basic island, and then cast Teferi's Ageless Insight. It resolves, and the turn is passed to Seth, and he'll begin with an Ignoble Hierarch, and he gets an experience counter. After this, he'll cast a Johnny Nakadal Pariah, and with its ETB trigger, he'll get a total of 2 experience counters. And there's also a Lotho trigger on Jason's side. Seth will then pass the turn, and as he passes through phases, Azuri will put 3 +1/+1 counters on Ignoble Hierarch. Now on Jason's turn, he'll start off with Skyclave Apparition. Ethan responds to the spell itself by activating the One Ring. Seth has a response to the activation with an Assassin's Trophy targeting Teferi's Ageless Insight, and he does pay the 1. Ethan responds to this with a Swan Song to counter the Assassin's Trophy. So that resolves, it's countered, and Seth gets a bird. And he also gets another experience counter. Alright, the stack has shrunk a little bit, but with the activation of the One Ring still in the stack, Jason will cast Anguished Unmaking, targeting Teferi's Ageless Insight, and he does pay the 1. And there's also a Lotho trigger. Ethan will then respond to this by activating Shorikai. He'll draw 4 and discard 1, that being a land, and he also gets a pilot.
Pilot! Yeah, he's a pilot! Great!
And then the Anguished Unmaking resolves, so the Insight is exiled. We then resolve the One Ring draw, so it's only 4 now. And then Skyclave Apparition will finally resolve, and it exiles said One Ring. And it is Jason's turn, so between the Anguished Unmaking and the Apparition, he does get 2 Ketramose triggers. After all this happens, Jason will attempt to equip his sword to Flicker Wisp. And I know it's hard to see, but Ethan's got 1 mana untapped. Here, look. And he'll use that to Swords to Plowshares the Flicker Wisp. And funnily enough, this will trigger Ketramose and also Lotho. He'll then bolt himself with a Fellmire, and then use it and a treasure to equip the sword to Ketramose. Jason will then move to combat, and Ketramose is swung over at Ethan, who can't block it, so he'll take 6 commander, and Jason will gain 6. There's a sword trigger that flickers the Recruiter again, which finds a Lauren of the Third Path, and also he finds a basic land, and there's a Ketramose trigger. After this, Jason will cast an Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Then he'll activate it to exile Seth's Balin and put a 1/1 counter on Ketramose. The turn isn't passed, but Matt stays on end step, and he'll cast Veil of Summer to essentially cycle it, and he does pay the 1. Then on cleanup, Jason will discard Virus Beetle, Burglar Rat, and Ancient Tomb. Alright, let's move to Matt's turn now, where he'll cast an Archdruid's Charm. He chooses to put a +1/+1 counter, which becomes 2, onto his Kami of Whispered Hopes, and it'll deal 3 damage to Skyclave Apparition. Good call, Matt. That is something that should not be allowed to stay on the board and get flickered. He does pay the 1, and then when Skyclave leaves, Ethan makes a 4/4. The turn is then passed to Ethan, and he'll start off with a Flooded Strand as land for turn. And he'll immediately crack it for a basic island. He'll then cast a Soul Ring, and then a Basalt Monolith, and this triggers Lotho. And then he'll cast a Rings of Bright Hearth. He'll also remember his Shorikai should be untapped. If you all don't know already, Rings of Bright Hearth and Basalt Monolith are an infinite combo. Matt says he's ready for a counter war against Ethan, but he wants Jason to get rid of the Esper Sentinel first. Who knows, 1 extra card could be the difference, so Jason will evoke Solitude. He'll exile a Charming Prince, and then Esper Sentinel is exiled, Ethan gains a life, and Solitude dies. Matt will then attempt to offer you can't refuse the Rings of Bright Hearth. No counter war here, Ethan accepts the offer, and he gets 2 treasures. With the rings now in the graveyard, Ethan will attempt to Savine's Reclamation them. Matt is actually a hero though, and he taps his Kami to hard cast a Fierce Guardianship. It is countered, and there's another Lotho trigger. Ethan remains unbothered though, he will cast Tezzeret the Seeker. This resolves, and Ethan will -4 Tezzeret, killing him. This finds him an Unwinding Clock to the battlefield. Then he passes the turn to Seth, and Ethan will untap his artifacts. Seth immediately recasts Najeela. He gets an experience counter and then moves to combat. Azuri will trigger, and his 2/2 flyer becomes a 6/6 flyer. Then Ethan will hold priority before attacks are declared, and he asks Seth, "Are you planning on hurting me?" And Seth says,
Yeah, very much so.
So Ethan will tap for 4 and use 3 of it to cast Stroke of Midnight, and he takes the damage from his talisman. It targets Najeela, so she is destroyed, and Seth gets a 1/1. And then with that last mana, Ethan will activate Shorikai to draw 2 and discard a land. He also gets a pilot. Seth is finally allowed to declare attackers, and he'll swing his Ignoble Hierarch over at Matt, and the 6/6 Bird over at Ethan, and they both just take their damage. The turn is then passed to Jason. And reasonably, the first thing he does with a Sword of Hearthenholm out is move to combat. He'll swing at Seth. And Seth can't block it, so he takes 7 commander. Damage trigger. Recruiter of the Guard is once again flickered, and he goes and gets another basic. There's a Ketramose trigger, and he tutors Delny to his hand. He'll then activate Agatha's Soul Cauldron to exile Ethan Savine's Reclamation, and he does put a counter on Ketramose when he shouldn't, because Savine's Reclamation is not a creature. Jason will then cast his Delny, and then Lauren, double ETB trigger, and also double Lotho trigger. Lauren triggers will target Shorikai and Unwinding Clock, and Ethan responds by activating Shorikai. He'll draw 2 and discard a Kappa Cannoneer, and looks like he found a Teferi's Protection. He'll cast it, and he takes another damage off his talisman. It then resolves, so Ethan disappears off the face of the earth, and he remembers to get his 3rd pilot. Then after this, Jason will cast Conjurer's Closet. He'll then move to his end step, and you'll never guess what he flickers. Yes, obviously Recruiter of the Guard. That thing has been flickered so many times this game, and now it has double triggers. And from these, he gets Witch Enchanter and Philia. We will then move to Matt's turn, where he will turn his Kami of Whispered Hopes sideways over at Seth, and he'll block with his cat and transform a Johnny. After this, Matt will cast Wood Elves, and this will find a Hedge Maze, and the Surveil stays on top, and then he'll pass to Ethan. Ethan decides it's time to vanquish the Horde. Jason has a response. He'll activate Ketramose's Balin ability by tapping 2 treasures to float a mana, and then he'll sacrifice 2 more treasures to cast Teferi's Protection. And Matt will also cast a Heroic Intervention. Man, poor Seth. After only half the board is wiped, Ethan will cast a Mox Opal, and then he'll activate Shorikai again. Discard his land, and then he'll cast the Reality Chip, and he puts it onto his pilot. He'll then cast Oswald Fiddlebender off the top of his library, and then he'll pass the turn to Seth, and after his artifacts have untapped, he'll flash in Shimmermere. Then a Thought Monitor, and then he activates Shorikai to draw 2 and discard Worn Power Stone. Alright, Seth can now finally take his turn. He'll start off with Ruhan the Fomori. Then he'll zero a Johnny, make a 2/1, and target Shimmermere with 2 damage. Ethan will respond by Get Losting Ruhan, which is Seth's only other red permanent, so the damage won't be dealt. That resolves, so Seth gets 2 map tokens. Seth then decides to crack both map tokens. First one is an Arcane Signet, which he puts in the graveyard, and the second one's a Breeding Pool, which goes to hand. Seth will then pass the turn to Jason, and on end step, Ethan will cast Enlightened Tutor, and this finds Sensei's Divining Top to the top of his library. Now on Jason's turn, he returns to existence and untaps. And then on Jason's upkeep, Ethan will cast the Sensei's Divining Top off the top of his library. And then he'll activate the top to swap his top. Seth senses some shenanigans here, so he decides to respond by pathing Shimmermere. Ethan will just negate in response though. Jason responds to that by activating Lauren to have him and Seth each draw a card, and then the stack resolves. Ethan then taps his Basalt Monolith to cast the Sensei's Divining Top again, then he'll flash in Fellwar Stone, and then Jason gets to move to his first main. He'll then cast the Eternal Wanderer, and he immediately -4s her. Jason picks his Ketramose, Matt's Wood Elves, Ethan's Equipped Pilot, and Seth's Cat, and all other creatures are sacrificed. And yes, Ethan is a silly Billy with a capital S. He does sacrifice Shorikai, but he realizes that's a mistake here in a bit. Jason will then cast Witch Enchanter. Ethan remembers that Shorikai is not a creature, so he's back on the field, and then Jason destroys Shorikai. After this, Jason will cast Emperor of Bones. And hey, look at that. Good on you, Jason. It looks like at some point you realized that Agatha's Soul Cauldron should not have given Ketramose that second counter. Anyways, Jason will move to combat, and Lord of Bones will trigger and exile Solitude. There's also a Ketramose trigger. Then, still at the beginning of combat, Jason will pay 2 mana to adapt to Emperor of Bones. This puts Solitude into play, and this will exile Ethan's last pilot. Jason will then declare attackers. It's Ketramose and Solitude, both over at Ethan. He'll put his Reality Chip in front of the Solitude, and before damage, Jason will activate Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Seth's Azuri is exiled, and Solitude gets a 1/1 counter. There's also a Ketramose trigger, and then Ethan will take 7 command damage, and his Reality Chip will perish. Jason will then pass the turn. He'll flicker Solitude on end step, and exile Seth's 3/2 cat. Let's move to Matt's turn now, where he'll play a basic forest, then cast Soul Ring, which allows him to cast Animar this turn. The turn is then passed to Ethan. On end step, he'll activate Sensei's Divining Top to rearrange his top. Then, on his turn, he'll cast a Trinket Mage. This will find Voltaic Key to his hand. and then Ethan will activate his top again. After that, he'll cast Voltaic Key, and then he'll recast Shorikai, who is then activated to draw 2 and discard. He'll then do it again by untapping Shorikai with Voltaic Key. Then he'll pass the turn to Seth, who starts off with a War Leader's Call. Then he'll cast Rada, Heir to Keld, and War Leader's Call will trigger. He'll then zero a Johnny, and he points 2 damage at Ethan. In combination with that and the War Leader's Call trigger from the cat entering, Ethan dies from this. Then the turn is passed to Jason. He'll start off with a Gisa the Hellraiser. Then he'll uptick Eternal Wanderer, targeting Seth's Rada. There is a crime committed, so he makes 2 2/2 tap zombies. He'll then cast Thonian Nightmare and get 3 energy on ETB. And then he'll use it, 3 energy, and a tap zombie to get Delny back to the battlefield. He'll then do it again, this time getting Lauren back to the battlefield. Double ETB trigger hits War Leader's Call and Matt's Soul Ring. Jason then moves to combat and he exiles Seth's Ruhan with Emperor of Bones. Then still at the beginning of combat, Jason activates his Cauldron to exile Matt's Kami of Whispered Hopes, and he puts another counter on his Emperor of Bones, which will put the Ruhan onto the battlefield. And since he's already in combat, he doesn't have to choose anyone to swing at randomly. So he'll swing Ruhan, Emperor of Bones, and Ketramose over at Seth. Seth asks how big things are, and Jason says 775, as in a 7, and a 5. And I think Seth mishears him. He thinks he says a 7 and a 5. So he thinks he's only taking 12 damage, so that's what he does. But this gets caught later and I'll adjust it then. So Seth goes down to 16. Post-combat, Jason will bog Seth, and then remembers his Sword of Hearth and Home trigger. He flickers Solitude and gets a basic, and the Solitude will exile Wood Elves. It's hard to see, but he'll cast an Arcane Signet after this. And then he'll move to end step and flicker Ruhan, which essentially just removes the finality counter from it. Jason will then discard 3 cards on cleanup, and will move to Matt's turn, where he'll cast Conclave Sledge Captain. Backup, and Animar trigger gets him 4 counters. Animar is then swung over at Jason. He can't block it, so he takes 5, and backup, gets Animar 15 counters. Then he'll pass to Seth, who will immediately cycle Indatha Triome. He'll then zero a Johnny, and he doesn't have another red permanent, so no damage, and then he'll pass to Jason, who flashes in Philia on end step. Rada also comes back, and then on Jason's turn, he slams Elishnorn. Alright, let's be honest here, this is probably the end of the game. He'll uptick his Emperor, and it exiles Matt's only blocker, and Seth's die to the Elishnorn. He'll then move to combat, Emperor of Bone exiles Skyclave Apparition. Jason then rolls to see who Ruhan goes at. It's Seth. And this is when we finally realize that Seth is up 7 more health than he should. He should be at 9. Big thank you to Jason for keeping track of life totals on a separate app, just in case stuff like this happens. So a 9/9 Ruhan goes and kills its owner. And more than 31 is being swung at Matt, so he is also dead here, making Jason and Ketramose the winners. Congratulations. Alright, welcome one, welcome all to the end of the video. Congratulations, Jason. I'm gonna be honest with you all, I have been working nonstop on this video all week. This was an extremely long game. I'm gonna cut this short here. I hope you all have a smooth day.